All right, folks, we are going to get started. So first of all, welcome and thank you all for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think we have a number of folks from Europe joining us today, so quite a span of time zones. I'm Yasha Franklin Hodge. I'm the Executive Director for the Open Mobility Foundation, and I'm just going to kick this off with a kind of quick introduction to who we are as the OMF and the work that we do, and then hand it over to the great group of panelists that we have to talk a little bit more about MDS 1.0.0, our latest release, and the subject of this webinar. So to start, I want to just introduce you all to the OMF. And I know many of you already know who we are and interact with us, but there are some new folks on the call. So the Open Mobility Foundation is a nonprofit open source software foundation. Whoops. Slides are jumping here. There we go. And we have the mission of building digital infrastructure that helps manage public space for the public good. In particular, what we do is we create data standards and open source software that allows cities and mobility companies to interact with each other, that facilitate the creation of tools for doing data analysis and management of public rights of way. Our goal is to build the plumbing of a digital system of data exchange and regulatory interaction that ultimately gives cities and other regulators new tools to manage public streets and to produce good outcomes for the communities that they serve. As I mentioned, we're a nonprofit, but we're structured as a public-private collaboration. We believe in the growth and development of new mobility services, but we also think that there's an important interaction that has to exist between regulators and the companies building those services to really make those services as successful as they can be. We also believe in building relationships and some shared understanding between sectors. You know, oftentimes public and private sector folks in this space only interact in a regulatory context. And, you know, when we look at the landscape, we see companies that are innovating, we see cities and local governments that are innovating, and we are trying to create the space where they can get to know each other, they can learn from each other, and they can hopefully work together towards building a common toolkit and some common language for how they interact. We are a membership organization. We have about 30 public sector members and close to a dozen private sector members. Any public sector organization can join the OMF for free. Private sector organizations pay to be members. We also have a couple of wonderful philanthropic supporters. The Knight Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation are both an important part of the OMF story. The thing that we are best known for and that we're going to be talking about today is the Mobility Data Specification. And this is an API that connects mobility companies with local governments. It's in use in at least 90 cities around the world. We don't have an exhaustive list since it is an open standard. Anyone can use it, and we often find out after the fact that a city has adopted it. But we see it in use around the world, you know, substantial uptake in the US, but we're now starting to see cities in Europe like Helsinki and Zurich and Marseille and Lisbon start to adopt MDS as well. In addition to facilitating that direct interaction between cities and mobility companies, one of the things that MDS has enabled is an ecosystem of companies who are building tools that use MDS to create analytic dashboards, to create data visualizations, to create policy enforcement tools for cities. So we're trying to foster that ecosystem and really support all of the organizations, public or private, that want to use MDS to build a business or to support their existing work. The other advantage that we see in MDS is that it really can accelerate the launch of new mobility services. You know, one of the big benefits that we've heard from a lot of mobility companies in the micromobility space is that it saved them a lot of time and effort when they went into a new city to have an existing data exchange mechanism in place that they could bring with them and not have to reinvent that wheel for every city that they went to. So, you know, for those of you who are familiar with us, you'll know MDS mostly through the micromobility context. But we envision our role as being bigger than just micromobility. And we are starting to expand the scope of our work to encompass other modes and other types of data and information exchange that support this larger mission of managing public space for public good. So we'd be happy to talk to you more about that, and we want to invite you to get involved. You can get involved by being a member, and we'd love to chat more about that. You can also get involved by being a technical contributor. All the work that we do is on GitHub. We have regular meetings that are open to the public where we talk through the latest features and planned additions. And so, we really encourage you, if this is interesting to you, if you're thinking about using MDS, please reach out to us. Here's some ways you can get in touch with us. And we'd love to chat more and hear what you're thinking about and what you're doing. So without further ado, I will hand over control to Michael, I believe, who's going to walk through some of the exciting new things in our most recent release of MDS.
Yep. Angela
Awesome.
was going to mention, Angela, do you want to mention the recording?
Yeah, so just a couple of things. Angela here from Open Mobility Foundation. Just want to mention as well that this webinar will be recorded, so we'll go ahead and share that when this is done. We'll also have Q&A at the end. So there is a Q&A feature in Zoom. You can ask questions in that chat. We'll answer them verbally at the end, but also our panelists might jump in and answer them throughout this webinar. You can also upvote questions that you think are interesting. So feel free to get in there and start asking questions, and then we'll go ahead and answer them at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michael, and we're going to dig into the latest release.
Okay, great. Thanks, Angela. So I'm going to give a quick little history of MDS. I don't know how often this has been done, and I kind of did some digging, but what you see here in the graph is a list of commits to the MDS repository over time. And you can see at the end on the right, there's a 1.0 release right before July, which is where most of the commits happen. And you can see we've done a lot of work on that release compared to the other ones over the last 2 years. And so far with MDS, there's been 74 individuals that have contributed to it, 155 forks, and you can see the other stats up there. So it's for an open source project, it's relatively popular. Let me see if I can control. All right, oh, there it goes. So this is another sort of view of the history of it. The version numbers on the left, we released version 1.0 September 16th. Took about 6 months. About half of that was active development time and half was approval and refinement time. And there were 75 issues and pull requests that were part of this release. And you can see a history going back to 2018 with the 0.1.0 release of how the timelines for each of these have increased and the number of issues and pull requests have generally increased as well. So for the 1.0 release, we started it in April and ended it in July, the main development of it. We do have a release planning page where you can see a history of that and see other meeting notes throughout that process. And of course, on GitHub, the release itself on all the release notes there. After that development time, we went to approval. And so this is how things get approved in the OMF based on our bylaws. So the release candidate was ready, the Tech Council reviewed it, the Tech Council had a recommendation to the board after a few changes, the board reviewed it, and then the board had a few changes, and then the board approved it, and we published it it was ready September 15th, published September 16th. And then before all this as well, we also have a privacy committee which reviewed it along the way of development. So key changes, what's new in MDS 1.0. So there are a lot of changes. These are just a few high level ones, some of which we'll talk about today. We added this idea of stops, of stopping locations, docks, corrals, things like that. We added an idea of rates within policy, so a city can define rates. And our speakers will talk about both of these today. But the biggest thing, maybe the hardest thing is that we aligned provider and agency, which was two of our API endpoints, and reconciled some of the historic naming differences between them. And we also updated our community info on the main GitHub page with more details and links. So for stops, these are flexibly defined parking locations. They could be anything from actual physical electric docking stations to spray paint on the ground. And there's also this idea of places to park within each of these stops. And it applies to both agency and provider right now, but not yet policy, although that is on the books for the next release 1.1. For rates, within policy, there's a way for a city to define rates, which are fees or subsidies for some action that is taken by a device or within the operating area of the city. So examples are maybe a 25-cent fee for riding through downtown, or $1 for every vehicle deployed, or 10 cents an hour for congested area parking, something like that. There's no money changing hands with this. It's just defining what the policy is in a digital way. And this is in beta at the moment, which means we welcome feedback. The third thing is the alignment of provider and agency. So they were very different. The naming conventions were different. The way vehicles went from one sort of state, like no one's riding it, to somebody's riding it, to it's on a trip, to it's been removed, were defined differently between these two APIs. And some states were not allowed or were missing from the implementation. So we aligned all of those, made sure we captured everything that the community wanted to see, including unknown states and missing and found and things like that. Things that are in the public right away, things that are out of the public right away as well. So we have a diagram to show that, and it's all enumerated in the docs. And lastly, a lot of more community information on GitHub. So a list of cities with links to their operating policies mentioning MDS. The list of providers has always been there with the CSV list with an ID, but we welcome other providers, of course, to be added. And we are trying to think of ways to highlight the providers with links as well. We have more related projects. So this is what Yasha mentioned, that community of open source tools that have been developed that are now available for anyone to use. And then we also have a list of use cases, which is currently a list of about 45 use cases that cities are using MDS for. And we will soon be releasing a more robust interactive version of that that's filterable, along with which cities are using which use cases. And some of this information is going to go on a new About MDS webpage, which we'll be launching soon, which synthesizes some of this. Let me go back one. So this is a chart of all of our releases and what we recommend people to use. So we recommend the last two major versions, including all their minor versions under that. So that means previously, before this release, it was the .4 and the .3 releases, any of those. And now with the 1.0 release, it's the 1.x and the .4 releases. And so you can see that in this chart here, which is also on the MDS releases page on GitHub. And the format is the numbers, the major, and then the second number is the minor, and the last number is a patch. And we have language on what it means to how we can update the ones that are current with documentation, patches, and guidance on our website. And then this is, I think, the last thing I'm going to talk about now, which is how to upgrade. So we do have a wiki page. It's off of our main wiki. You can find it there on the MDS repo. But it's a guide for key upgrade topics that you might be interested in, kind of an FAQ for upgrading. It includes some of the information I just mentioned on version naming, what's a current release, what's not, and then vehicle states and events. So this is where the APIs have been reconciled name-wise. And we have charts like the one you see on the right for provider that show the previous event type and event type reason names and how they've been migrated to a vehicle state and an event type. And the changed items are in bold on the right. So this guide is to help you understand these changes. And we also welcome you to let us know if there are other things you'd like to see in this upgrade guide. And as we get questions, I'll keep that updated as well. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to Nick in Chicago.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Yasha and Angela and everyone. Congratulations on your release, and this is very exciting to see MDS continue to move forward, and I'm really excited to talk with you all today, just to I think put a little experience and context onto the release today. So I'll talk a little bit about Chicago's experience with mobility data, but also the STOPS API. So I'm going to move the screen forward, but just give me just one moment while I see that I can. Oh, there we go. A little too far. Okay, great. So a little bit about myself. I work in the mayor's office here in the city of Chicago, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, and my job is to oversee data strategy and policies for the whole city. Where that comes in with mobility data is that a big part of it is consulting with departments of transportation for choices on their data standards and models, and whether to use MDS and whether to use any other data standards and how to design data standards. Prior to being Chief Data Officer, which I've been in this role for this year, basically, I was a data scientist working on operations for about 3 years. And in that job, I took data like MDS data and turned it into information that our departments could use in order to better deliver on what their responsibilities were. And I say this last part just to apologize. I'm a courtroom attorney by trade from the past, so if any of those tendencies bleed in, you have my apologies, but I think it's helpful. It's been helpful for me in understanding my role to have that experience. So I'll dive right in now to a little bit about our experience, and if the screen may take a second to, there we go. Yeah, where did we get started? In 2013 is when we first started collecting mobility data. And that was with the emergence of ride-hail in 2013. And in the same year, we launched our first bike share. This is our flagship docked bike share system called Divvy, launched back then too. And so that's when we got into the practice of obtaining this information. You know, this information that we knew that companies collected themselves in order to understand their operations. And cities need a little part of that data to understand, you know, where are these vehicles and how are they operating and how is that affecting our residents in the delivery of a public service. In 2018, we experimented with dockless bikes in our bike share. And it was 2019 with our scooter pilot that we first started using MDS data, and still are for our continuation of our scooter pilot in 2020 right now. It's going on, and also this year we've unveiled a e-bike component of our bike share. And so our bike share is now hybrid, docked and dockless with 2 different kinds of bikes. And so we're learning through that right now. So what do we do with this data? You know, I think that's obviously a big interest is why do cities, why do you need this? Just a couple of examples of some real impactful reports and studies that have guided actual actions in government. Just picked a couple of them here. We in fall of 2019 passed a congestion tax on ride-hail that was fully data-driven. Everything about how the tax worked and the incentives that were baked in and the pricing was fully based on the data that we collected from ride-hail to understand how's this going to impact and how's this going to achieve the goals of the initiative, which is to reduce congestion and make services more equitably available across the city. Also, a full evaluation of our e-scooter pilot from 2019 that was a very thorough investigation as to what were some of the key uses, how did scooters fit into the framework of mobility in Chicago, and what do we need to change next time. And we've made a lot of changes in how we did it in 2020 based off of the data. And then finally, a big task force report on transportation mobility that came out last year. I think highlights some real key uses of what we do with mobility data. And so just a little background on what we do with it. Data standards, when we first started collecting data, we made it up. There were no standards. There was GTFS for transit, and that was it. And so a lot of homegrown solutions were put together, a lot of CSV collection, collaborating with other cities. We talked with any cities that we could who were doing this kind of thing to understand how are they collecting it. We don't want to be difficult on providers. Like, we really want to make it easier for everybody. And so we try to align our standards. We want businesses to be able to have a low bar of entry in order to come in and be part of the framework here. So, data standards have always been a goal. GBFS was around, and which was great for one picture, the public picture of the data, but it wasn't until MDS in 2019 when we first started using it that we had experience with a real robust way to get the information that we needed without having to come up with it all on our own. So, talking specifically about DOCT, I'm gonna focus on this because I'm gonna talk about the new Stops API. What's our data model for DOCT bikeshare? It's trips, which is it starts and stops. It's very there's not much to it, and we receive that by CSV files. And because these are DOCT stations, you have the station where it took off from and the station where it went to. And then in order to understand what's available at stations and utilization, we literally scrape the GBFS feeds in order to put together a picture of that. And that's our DOCT bikeshare model. What I love about the new Stops API is that it provides cities an alternative to that. I don't think this can be understated, that having to build your own way of scraping GBFS feeds and then also collecting MDS data alongside it, it creates an integration issue that you have to deal with. It's really nice to imagine everything all coming together in one way. And so, what else is cool about it is that it's got, it's not just stations. It's got the corrals and the painted parking areas, as Michael was talking about earlier. I think it presents a way for a city not to have to create its own homegrown solution. It also gives an opportunity to a city that has done that to replace it. Combining this endpoint with the other endpoints, I just think it gives a better option than creating your own standards and dealing with CSVs. So we're really excited to see this. And then finally, I wanted to just have a quick note on privacy, because I thought there's been a really interesting development that I'm a big follower of. It was that with GBFS before the 2.0 version, they had this bike ID that could be persistent. And what we saw was, you could potentially figure out where someone went or see where they came from by looking at GBFS and seeing, where the bikes went to, even though it would disappear during a trip. I don't want to get into technical weeds too much, but you could potentially find out information about locations. And GBFS removed that because of the privacy concerns in 2.0. Well, that was being used by cities to understand availability and to understand scooter movement. And so the MDS Vehicles API, I think, replaces that functionality in a way that makes sure that it's not public, because the MDS API is not public. So I thought it was a really great problem solution story. And putting these two actions together, gives gives regulators what they need while maintaining privacy on the public-facing feeds. So it's just really cool to watch these standards develop in ways and complement each other in these ways. And so I just wanted to mention that because it was pretty interesting. So I'll, that concludes my comments here now. So I'll pass it over to Brian.
Thanks, Nick. And hey, everyone, and thanks to everyone at the OMF for organizing this event and hosting us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about policy rates, but first, let's see if this actually works. Is that going to go forward? Let's see here. Yeah, let me introduce myself real quick. So I'm Brian Ellin. I'm the head of city products at Ride Report. And if you're not familiar with Ride Report, we're a unified platform for real-time and historical shared mobility data. Our dashboard provides a common operating view from which cities and operators can align on data and metrics, and our specific focus is around managing program compliance, auditing, and invoicing. We joined the OMF as private sector members earlier this year, I think around, gosh, it must have been the March or April timeframe. And I'm going to talk a little bit about policy and some of the stuff we've been collaborating on with the community with respect to rates. But before we jump directly into rates, I want to give a super duper quick recap on policy. What is MDS policy? Rates are a part of the policy API, which is intended to be a platform for describing and communicating policies primarily for the purposes of regulation. It's not about enforcement of that regulation. It's about describing the actual rules and communicating those rules. A policy was introduced as part of MDS 4.0 last year. And a policy as a concept in the API is made up of a, 0.4. Thanks, Mark. A policy is made up of rules that apply to a geography. And so there's a variety of rule types that are very, very expressive. I'll speak to a few here. The first one is around the count rule. So with the count rule, you can apply and describe rules around fleet caps, deployment requirements. So for example, if the city had a requirement that X number of vehicles needed to be available in a certain geography or area of interest at a certain time, you would express that through the count rule type. You can also express no vehicle zones. And speed is a rule type that allows you to express the max or minimum speed of a vehicle, and that can be applied to a slow speed zone or setting a speed limit in a specific area. And the time rule type enables cities to express things like idle times, how long a vehicle can exist in a certain state in a certain area. If you're interested in MDS policy more broadly, I'd really encourage you to take a look at the video for the policy webinar that OMF hosted, I believe a few weeks ago. It's about an hour and a half long, and it goes very deep into a lot of these topics. And there's a variety of presenters on a variety of use cases, really can go deep on understanding what policy can do and how to apply it for your particular use case. So how rates came to be. So through the lens of our focus on compliance and auditing and eventually invoicing, one of the things we wanted to do is develop a better understanding of the policy API and what use cases we could unlock for our city customers. And so one of the things we started doing first was taking the cities we were working with, looking at their program rules and actually attempting to translate them into policy JSON, which was a really fun activity. We were able to express nearly all of the rules in the cities we're working with. But one of the things that we realized is that a number of the key rules around price There was no way to express those yet, whether this is a fee or a subsidy. There was not a way to describe that inside of MDS policy. And so we saw that as a, hey, this feels like an opportunity to add this to the specification. And fortunately, as an open source and extensible API, we were able to engage in the process. We submitted an issue kind of describing the problem on GitHub. That eventually led to some great conversation, collaborating with other companies in the community and other cities. We submitted a PR, and it evolved based on community feedback for inclusion in 1.0. If I recall correctly, I think the original rule PR we proposed was really focused on fees alone. And so through community feedback, we evolved that to also work for subsidies, and we changed the name to rates. So that community process was key to kind of getting it into a spot where the broadest set of use cases for cities was served. So what is the rate rule type? We talked about counts and speeds, things like that earlier. Now there's a new rule type. It's called rate. A rate can either be a fee or a subsidy. It's quite simple. The rate amount specifies the amount that should be applied when a vehicle transitions into specific states. And a rate recurrence specifies the frequency through which that rate should be applied. I'll give a quick example of a per trip fee. So this is getting a little wonky here. We're looking at the policy JSON. You can see kind of near the top, the rule type is set to the amount. The rate amount is set to be 25. So in this case, this would be a 25-cent per trip fee. The rate recurrence is once, so this would be applied one time when the trip starts. You can see the on-trip start state in this particular geography. And geographies in MDS are represented through a separate API, but through this unique identifier. So in this scenario, this identifier represents the city limits. So this is intended to represent a simple per trip fee. Other use cases for rates, it's really expressive, and you can express things like subsidies for trips that start or end in a specific geography. So you saw back on the previous slide, there was the number 25, that's 25 cents. For example, if you wanted to have a $1 subsidy for a trip that ended in a specific geo, you could specify -100, which would be -100 cents, which would represent that as a subsidy. And then you could specify the state as a trip end and the geos where you would want that to apply. Other rates that you can or use cases that you can implement here around like vehicle right-of-way usage fees. So a daily fee for the space a vehicle might take up as part of the public right-of-way. Metered parking fees. And again, you can kind of, through the flexibility of the policy API, you can specify this pricing by day of week, time of day, really to meet the needs of the city. And just to speak a little bit about how we're building on this at Ride Report, we're inside of the Ride Report dashboard. We've enabled the ability for city customers to describe their rate-based policies and then track those policies based on real-world MDS usage, which then is flowing into a new suite of products that allow for the automation of the invoicing and billing processes. We're really interested in policy, the future of policy, doing more with rates. If this is interesting to you, I'd encourage you to check out ridereport.com. And that's all we had to share today. Thanks for having us. Let's see, I think I'm going to hand it back over now to Michael.
Yes, thank you. Let me get control. So I'm going to talk about looking ahead to the 1.0 release briefly, and then we can get into the Q&A. in advance. Yep. So first off, feel free, if you're interested in any of this and you want to participate and get some of your ideas into the release like Ride Report did last release with the rates, check out our release planning page, and there's a link down there, and these slides will be shared later. It shows the current timeline of the release from bottom to top, reverse chronological, and shows proposed features and links to those features and a little bit of summary. And it also has links to our weekly working group meetings like the one we had earlier today that anyone can join and participate in and give feedback on. So things that are currently planned for 1.1, we have this idea of metrics. So a way to get aggregated, rolled up, standardized reporting calculations of things within MDS, like counts of vehicles, averages, trips taken, number of trips taken, number of vehicles out, things that are in the public right of way, et cetera. And then even some other data that is outside of MDS, like potentially stats for certain groups of users, like ones that counts of users that may participate in a discounted program based on low income or status or something like that. And the other benefit of having this sort of endpoint that you can query that returns aggregated data instead of disaggregated data is there's privacy consideration as well. So for instance, you can get the data you need without having to look at every individual trip. It's less data to work with as well. And it also allows alignment between cities and providers with some of the definitions around these counts, which can, depending on how you slice and dice things like averages and times and other things that cities want to count and potentially even charge for, you can get different numbers, whether you're looking at MDS or reports from dashboards or CSV files that are sent to cities. So this helps with that alignment. We also, the geography idea is going to be generalized for all of MDS. So right now it's within policy, as Brian talked about. So it's the way currently you can define a geographic area and put rates on that and other things, but we want to make it available for all of MDS, so including metrics. So it could be used for an operational area, an equity area, a slow speed area, a parking area, et cetera. Those can all be defined, and we want it to be across all of MDS. So stops are also looking to be expanded across all of MDS. So right now they're not in policy. We want to make sure we add them to policy. So stopping locations can be defined geographically with properties within a city's digital policy. We have the idea of places within stops now, but we want to give them some more details, like potentially, does this parking place have charging or not? How many devices could be docked here? What's the current status of those docks, if they're charging docks or walk to locations? And then images that are provided by the city of each stop that can be passed on to the consumer at the end of their rides to help them find the location that they are closest to and they should park in. And then lastly, and this is the fourth thing, but there's a lot of other things as well if you dig into what we're looking at, but jurisdictions, this is helping to define policy enforcement areas, and it allows for something called policy-driven events, which is vehicles that enter or leave a jurisdiction. For some cities, this isn't a big deal. Like if you think of Louisville, I'm in Louisville, and the city kind of operates on its own and it's not near other cities. But if you look at Long Beach and California, places in California and Santa Monica, there's a lot of devices that enter and leave jurisdictions. I think Miami is another great example. So this helps jurisdictions track those vehicles and know when they're who's responsible for those vehicles and how they get counted. So if you're interested, please check out on GitHub our meetings and jump right in with your comments on any of these open issues or pull requests. All right, I'll pass it back over to Angela. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Nick and Brian, as well. It's really exciting to see a lot of these features. They're things that those of us who have been in the space, I think, have talked about and dreamed of for a while, and it's really cool to see the evolution. So we're going to go ahead and dive into Q&A time. So I'm going to thank you so much. We had folks send in questions when they registered. So we do have some of those that we'll get to, but right now I'm going to start with the questions that are in the chat. Feel free to add questions and comments in that Q&A section now. But I'm going to start with Gary asked, does MDS help track specific routes that users take? For example, is it possible to map street segments that are used more than others?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yes, so MDS does have a trips endpoint within policy. Also, you can do something similar in agency, but for this use case, you can get the routes that are taken. Now, it's not exactly by what the routes that the users are taking. We kind of track the vehicle more, so we know that a vehicle went from here to there and the route they took. It's not connected to any specific user, or you can't tie those to individuals or know who took which trip. But yes, the geographic locations of those vehicles is known, and you can connect that to your street segments. And many cities do that. Minneapolis has a good public data set where they've snapped some of the routes to street segments. And many of the third parties have that ability as well.
Cool, thank you. So Philippe says, kudos on the addition of rates. Yes, it's very exciting. I'm assuming that there is no in MDS method to condition negative rates or subsidies to specific users. Like, for example, if you wanted to target specific rates for older users or income-based, et cetera.
Right, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take that one. No, the answer is not at this time. So MDS is really about helping govern the vehicle itself, and so there's no that information about the particular individuals or users and the properties of them are not available for application to rates. It's more about the broad description of the rules itself.
This is a fun one for Nick and Michael. Can you explain the use case for the images feature mentioned for stops in 1.1?
Yeah, I'll mention what it is again, and maybe Nick, you can think of your use case. But the idea is that a photograph or a diagram of each stopping location for a device, whether that's painted, spray paint, or a corral or a dock, can be captured in an image, a photo or something, and then attached to the information about the stop within the policy that the city is publishing to providers. So that way, well, one, the providers can get a view of what this location is physically on the ground in real life, but also the provider could then choose to pass that on to a rider, so that when you're ending your ride, the mobility service provider, like let's say Spin, they could pop up an image to the rider and say, here's where you should park, it's the closest place, this is what it looks like. And maybe even instructions on how to park, like if it's a diagram, here's the spots or something like that.
Yeah, the Michael's use case was the exact one I had in mind, where it's that that service to the user to make it so that it's a friendly experience, and that, you know, I think it's accessibility, it's mobility. It gives people that information that makes it an easier experience, and that's what we care about when it comes to people's use of mobility sources.
And it's a way to digitally put that into the policy too, right? So it's easier to communicate that to everyone, as opposed to if you made a change to that location, having to email a bunch of providers and communicate that some way that's not as efficient.
Yeah, good point. Cool. So the next question is from Clemens. Congrats on the release. what are your plans to further integrate other modes of transport for mobility as a service or MOS, or sync with initiatives like the Open Transport Alliance?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Great question. So, you know, we are starting to look at expansion of MDS into a few other modal areas. There's at least a couple of our members I know are working on a project to extend MDS to support data gathering about certain types of automated delivery vehicles or robots that go on the sidewalk. We are also, we have an exploratory committee that's looking at the ways we might integrate passenger transportation services into MDS. We sort of still haven't decided what precisely that's going to look like. But we are looking at other areas of modal expansion. And so we're pretty excited about that. In terms of MOS and our relationship to that, you know, we have good sort of partnerships. Nick referenced the GBFS specification, and that's stewarded by an organization called Mobility Data, and we have a great partnership relationship with them. You know, when we think about MOS, a lot of the focus is often on the consumer side. So it's, you know, how do consumers discover a service, book a trip, plan a trip, book it, pay for it. And we as an organization, as the Open Mobility Foundation at this point, are not primarily focused on those types of consumer experiences. Instead, we're focused on the relationship between service providers and regulators or operators of public rights of way, and really enabling their side of the equation. You know, how do we manage services? How do we incentivize them? How do we charge fees? How do we make sure our infrastructure accommodates them? And so the way we think about MOS is, you know, not that we are going to become an enabler of the consumer-facing side, but rather that we want to work closely with organizations like Mobility Data. I think the questioner also asked about an Open Transport Initiative in the UK. We have a good relationship with them. You know, so we want to work closely with those types of organizations that are very much focused on the consumer side to make sure that data models align and that it's easy for regulators to sort of understand how emerging MOS services and platforms are actually starting to get used by consumers and starting to shape the mobility landscape. So we view this as kind of we're each two sides of a coin, and you know, really trying to build those strong partner relationships with the other organizations that do this kind of work.
Cool. Yasha, I'm going to keep you on for a second. There was another question about CURB, and are you planning on linking MDS to CURB LR Accord or other CURB management initiatives? So can you dig into the future of CURB a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a timely question. Thank you, Carlos, for asking that. So I may be breaking some news here, as it were, but we, the OMF board approved the creation of a CURB management working group last week at our most recent board meeting. We have a number of our member cities who are exploring a variety of different CURB management strategies, from reservations to dynamic flex zones, looking at fee structures. There's a huge amount of interest right now on the public sector, from the public sector, on how to change the way they manage CURB to make it more dynamic and to make, frankly, better use of this really scarce resource. So we are stepping into that space to try to help build some of the tooling. But as the questioner pointed out, there's some really exciting initiatives already underway in that space. There is the company Coord, there is CURB LR from Shared Streets. There's a couple of other organizations that are working in the space. So we are really excited by the idea of helping to convene multiple stakeholders to create something that can truly be treated as a standard. And we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we are bringing in the existing organizations that are working in the space and looking to, you know, to partner with them or to integrate their work in a way that can allow us to move towards standardization of approaches to CURB data, and still take advantage of all the great efforts that have already been done. So there'll be more to announce down the road, but if curb management is something that is interesting to you, we are working on it. We are excited about the potential to bring sort of true standards in this space to market, and we'd love to get you involved in the work that we're doing. So please reach out to us.
Absolutely. Okay, don't unmute yourself yet. I have one more big kind of future-facing question about MDS being designed for newer mobility services, but what are the longer-term possibilities or use cases around managing urban tolling, congestion pricing policies, things like that, and what would be involved in the implementation of them? That's a really big question, but
yeah, that's its own webinar. But I mean, you know, short answer I would give is just to say that you know, we're really interested in all the ways that digital technologies and APIs can facilitate better management of public streets and public space. We are focused on new mobility services primarily because those are places that already, the new means that they're sort of natively digital. And so, you know, we're looking at those as sort of the places where we can demonstrate early wins, where we can pilot different regulatory strategies, where we can learn what works and what doesn't, both technically and from a policy perspective. Eventually, you may see digital first models of management or pricing being applied beyond just new mobility services. I'm certainly hopeful that the work that we're doing, especially some of the things we've talked about today, you know, the work that Brian talked about with the policy API, that's the beginning of a way to define things like congestion zones or you know, places that have different market incentives associated with them. It's certainly not built out to the level where you could apply it to, you know, replace traditional approaches to congestion pricing. But over time, as this technology starts to evolve and as we see it in the real world, I think we're going to learn a lot of really valuable lessons about how to do this, and hopefully those will be applicable well beyond new mobility services. So stay tuned. And if you're interested in these kinds of you know, new approaches to pricing and market management, definitely connect with us, and we can you know, make sure that the perspective you bring is part of our thinking as we develop and evolve these tools.
awesome. So this next question is for Michael. Carolyn asked to dig into geographies a little bit more and what it means in terms of implementation, like can they exist on their own in MDS, et cetera?
Yeah, so that's correct. So her question was, is the proposal for it to become a top level first class endpoint? And it is. So we have 3 endpoints now, our APIs with multiple endpoints. Now we have provider, policy, and agency. So this would be a 4th one called geography. And that allows it to live on its own. Geographies can be defined on their own, and then referenced across any of the other endpoints and APIs that way. And I put a link to that proposal in the chat right now.
Awesome. And another question for you, is there a reference implementation of 1.0.0 already available on GitHub?
Yes, so if you go to our main MDS GitHub homepage, there is a area called Related Projects. It's towards the bottom, and it talks about and links to projects that other cities in the community have built that are open source, where they've released their work. There's a few examples within that of implementations of ingesting or doing more with MDS. The examples that are there are the City of Los Angeles has something. Now, what they've contributed is something called MDS Core to the Open Mobility Foundation. So you can see that there. They've actually kind of handed over the code base to OMF, and it's a version of it is living within our organization on GitHub, although they are still continuing to work on it on their end. Santa Monica has one as well called MDS Provider and Provider Services. And then Austin has one as well called ATD MDS, which is a way to ingest provider information. So if you're tech savvy, you can go there and sort of see what other cities have put out there and use it for yourself.
Amazing, thank you. Well, that's all the time that we have. We've received some other questions that we will kind of provide answers to in some of our follow-up resources. I know we had a lot of European cities online, so really appreciate you all joining from all over. Again, this is recorded, so we'll go ahead and share the recording, more resources, links to GitHub, to Twitter, to our website so that you can sign up for our newsletter and stay in the loop on more events like this, organizational news, all that good stuff. So we really appreciate you for joining, and thank you to Nick and to Brian for sharing some more about your experience and these case studies. And that's it for today. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks.
Thank you.